Not bad. Let's give it one more shot. Hello and welcome. This great lecture was recorded in Share Square, located in Belgrade, Serbia. Great place for co-working or solo working. Live and interactive tutorials for boosting your informal education. Pay for the time spent and enjoy free coffee or tea and cookies and great fiber optic Wi-Fi. For additional information, visit their website, which you can find in the description below. And now, the story of chai. Tea time through history and regions, lectured by Aron Kaya.
Listen, would you smell? I'm holding something in front of you.
Okay.
Can you smell?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you also smell and pass to each other? This is Rize tea from the northern coast, Black Sea side of today's Turkey. Okay? It's the Black Sea coast of Turkey, of a city called Rize, and it is one of the most popular Black Sea leaves that exists. Turks are crazy about it, and Russian black tea is something very, very similar because it's from the same geographies north. I mean, around the water or across the water, we can say. This is the tea that we're going to be tasting as a Turkish tea. The only place I was able to find it over here, there's a lot of black tea. There's Ceylon black tea, there is a mixed black tea, there's Assam black tea, but I found this by a request, begging. You have a Turkish chain over here called Simit Saray. They're selling gevrek. They serve Turkish tea, and I thought they would be using real Turkish tea, you know, to be able to serve it. For that reason, they were kind enough to give us a pack that we will be using today. Now, because the lady has work and she's going to go, this, and imagine one a little bit bigger than this. Let me, for example, give you an idea like this immediately. Over there on the tea tray, but there's a traditional one over here, you can see. This is the one on the top, and there's supposed to be one at the bottom, and the water boils in the one at the bottom, while the tea leaves only with a few drops of water, after the water at the bottom boils, are moisturized. And then, after they start giving their aroma, and especially starting to grow bigger as they get wet, we fill this with the water at the bottom up till 2/3 of it and wait like 4 or 5 minutes for it to brew. You never put this with the tea leaves on top of the fire. It is the water below. At the Ottoman time and at the Russian time, they were using the samawars for this purpose. We will see a samawar picture in a while. We're creating with the lady a samawar over here for you. So a little while later, like probably half an hour later, using this tea, we are over here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people, 11, 12, let's say. 6 dessert spoons of this we're going to place into this. And we will put a few drops of water so it will moisturize. Then 30 seconds later we will put water and put it on top of the samovar. So we will be coming.
At 6:35.
Yes, please, please. I'll give you these two. Thank you very much. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I had to do that first so it will be prepared at the stage that we feel like a little break. And besides that, as I will be able to talk over there about the traditional way of the way Turkish tea or Balkan tea, you know, if you consider Balkan more like the southern or southwestern Balkan, you know, the part that has more Bulgarian Greece effect. I know over here when you say Balkans, you usually talk about Central Balkans and ex-Yugoslavia, and that makes people with Greek or Turkish background like felt out of the game, or the Romanians, because when I was young, when I was around my teenage years, even though I was not in this geography, there was the Balkan Championship, maybe you will remember. And the Balkan Championships, hello, welcome, usually considered 4 or 5 countries. And everybody knew who was going to pick the gold medals. Yugoslavia was going to pick the gold medals for sure, you know. So it was important to be the second. But we were laughing a lot when somebody came and say, oh, we are the Balkan third, or we are the bronze medal owners of Balkan. We say there's already 5 countries, so if you're third, you're like in the middle. But the Balkan concept was large, of course, the Balkan concept I grew up with. And that concept is related to my background, coming from a mother who is from Thessaloniki, Greek, and a father who is Cypriot, from Cyprus. He is related to Lebanon, but he's coming from a Turkish blood. So they're very Ottoman altogether, we would say. But I grew up in the West. I grew up in Europe and mainly in States, and that's where I call home, New York. And my name is Ron. It's nice to welcome you all
Hi, Ron.
here. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's lovely. I wasn't thinking of staying in Belgrade to be able to share any of my knowledge or any of the skills that I have. But I turned out to like it a lot, especially coming after smaller cities like Skopje, Sarajevo, even though they're beautiful. Belgrade, probably I missed the big cities that I lived in, took me with its charm. And I'm going to stay a little bit longer, so you're going to see a few of these lectures or speeches or, sharings, as we would say. And it's a delight to be able to do this, and it's nice for Share Square to be able to create something like this so we can make use of it. Today the subject is tea, and tea is actually something that has a lot to talk about. You can talk for hours and hours on tea. I personally am a cook. I'm cooking since the age 14. Started on gulets and boats in between the Greek islands. There was a reason for that. When you were a handyman, you were paid a certain salary. When you were a cook, you were paid a better salary. And if you were able to do both of them, then you were paid a good salary. So one of the first years that I got into working on the boats, I decided it would be better for myself if I learn how to cook. But that has a lot. If you ask like more than half of the cooks on the planet now, they are mainly influenced by a person whom they will call grandma or grandmother. And my idol was my mother's side, my Thessaloniki grandmother, the way she cooked, the way she used spices. So I became a chef. But I'm also an historian. I studied history in NYU, and I did my master's in London on Balkan folk culture, traditions and food. And the way coffee is drank in the Balkans, tea, other specialties, all of them, the music, dancing, all of those, got involved. So if you wonder why is a cook, a chef talking about tea, it is within my interest area, and it is related in a certain way. A good cup of tea is a very good digestive. It could complete a very, very nice lunch. It could complete a very nice meal, even if you're British, and if you don't have the, fact of being able to drink tea all over the day. Americans would never, for example, after 3 o'clock, you can't make any American drink tea. They will think they won't be able to sleep. But that is one of the major things. Tea itself, especially when we're talking about it as a drink that has a very, very long history, going all the way back to China. It was created as a drink, some sources say accidentally. Some sources say at the very beginning it was a sort of a meal. And matcha, or chai, actually, as it was derived afterwards, was created from this sort of a breakfast meal that they were making with tea leaves, some grains, and putting sweet in it, like honey. And later on, they decided to drink this. But there are legendary, like everything, legendary sources. And one of the sources that is believed a great deal in the Yunnan section of southwestern China is that around the 3rd millennium, 2700s BC, the legendary Chinese emperor Shangnan was sitting under a tree drinking his hot water, bowl of hot water. And accidentally the wind that arose made some leaves from the tea bushes, wild tea bushes behind, drop into his bowl. And he realized that the color was changing, so he waited a little while, and afterwards he got a sip. And they say after that he never quit it, and he became the greatest tea drinker. Now, Chinese sources mix two legends with each other. There's another Chinese legend that is related to their god of agriculture. And the god of agriculture, Sharianama, is known to be the one who was chewing the wild herbs and spitting them to realize the effect that they had on them and his body. So he was introducing to his children, his daughters and sons, the people on the planet. This is mythological, China, shaman China. And when he chewed the tea leaves, he realized that it was good for his stomach. It was settling his stomach because he was known as that was one of the prices he had to pay as the god of agriculture. Many of the wild herbs and the green that he was tasting was poisonous. So he had his stomach pains, but the tea settled his stomach pain, and he said, this is good for you. And after that, people started to drink the tea too. But what we know generally is that tea, as a very, very ancient drink, existed in old-time China for a very long period of time. And we say maybe 5,000 years, maybe 6,000 years, it has an history. Because we know from the stories that are told from mouth to ear in Chinese folk culture, there are a lot of stories about tea. And one of them is very, very much related with Buddha Radharani. Buddha Radharani is the founder of the Chan Buddhism. And he is known to be a monk that had created a lot of new waves in Buddhism. But one of the things that is related to him in Chinese history is when he was a young monk, his duty was the night guard the temple. And he was supposed to be awake all night long. But after being in front of the wall that he was facing in his, relaxed position, 9 hours later, he was not able to help, and he fell asleep. And when they woke him up, he was so ashamed that they say he cut his eyelids and he threw them to the garden. Over there where those eyelids were thrown, tea bushes started to grow. And the reason why tea keeps us awake, the fact that tea is avoiding you from sleeping, is because of that experience Buddha Rahmi had, and his eyelids that he cut not to fall asleep at all. Afterwards, turned out to be tea leaves that doesn't let us sleep. That is the story that the Chinese believe, and it is one of the legendary ones. But if we come to facts, the real facts, China is known to be the first place where tea was produced as a merchandise, as a material to be sold, to be traded. And it was mainly used for their inner market. And at the beginning it was generally used for high-class people, for the imperials. It was later when, at the Tang Dynasty time, the emperors decided that it should be grown all over China, so the normal people would have access to it too. It became a major merchandise. And during this time, the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, we're talking about 6th century this time, some monks that came to study Buddhism in China from Korea and Japan took tea leaves with them and shared with their higher priests and some wealthy people of their own countries. For example, a monk like this called Ye Sai or Yan Sei is the one who is responsible of taking tea to Japan. And after they really enjoyed it and liked it, as one of the people who was introduced and offered this tea Yan Sei took was the Japanese emperor of the time. He liked it so much that he wanted seeds to be brought and for people to grow it. He gave encouragement for all Japan to be able to grow the tea and everybody to be able to have the tea. But even then, in Japan, it was a big spiritual and it was rich people's thing. Wealthy people had tea boxes. The geishas who were responsible would be holding the key, and like gold or something very valuable, during the tea ceremony, the amount of tea that was necessary for the amount of people who were going to be served was taken, the box was locked again, and it was one of the most serious responsibilities of the household. In Japan, among the geishas of the house, the one whom was the most liked, the one whom was the most encouraged, and the ones whom was the most privileged was the one who carried that key, the tea box key. This is interesting because a little while later, when I come to that stage, you will see that much after the Japanese, approximately 11 centuries later, almost 1,000 years later, in the Victorian era, the British woman and the servants of the house in the British household, the butler or the lady in charge or the lady in wait who was responsible of all of the other servants of the house was the one who held the key of the tea box, which was also a very valuable item at the 17th century England, when everybody or anybody, the person working on the street as today, was not able to drink tea. But we will come to that stage. Now, the important thing is, when tea was grown in China, and when it was created to become a popular drink and started its mercenary history within that geography of the world, of course, the places like today's Cambodia, Vietnam, or Korea, Japan, it made its way. But how did it make it to Europe? This is interesting, because the way it made to Europe was actually with the colonization. And the very, very first ones to be able to be introduced to something like this tea itself was the Portuguese. Because the very first among European powers that actually had a hold of a certain territory over here was the Portuguese. And it was Macau, the privileged part of China today, or the Las Vegas of China today. But Macau was actually known as the place where the Portuguese for the very first time saw tea. And they took tea to Africa, to some of their other colonies, and to Middle East. Lebanon was the first Middle Eastern territory that tea was introduced, and this was done by the Portuguese. Portuguese ships brought with trade the other material they were carrying, like the silk and like the porcelain Chinaware, the tea to Lebanon too. And from that moment on, we're talking about 1600, 1635 to 1650, Middle East got introduced to tea. When this was happening, there was a great big fight taking place within the territories of this zone and the sea trade that it was creating between the Dutch from Holland and the British. There was a company called the Dutch Indian Company, and they are known as the very first company that was responsible of taking the Chinaware and the silk to Europe. This is also the background of the Dutch Delft tiles. When you go to Holland, when you go to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, everybody ends up with these souvenirs, blue and white, Dutch tiles. They are copied from the Chinaware that was first introduced, with the trade. But the interesting thing is, the British got involved in the picture too. At this time, tea was not known as a drink, and nobody knew what it was in Europe. 2 times it was mentioned though. Once by an Italian who was called Giovanni Battista, and once by a Portuguese who was called Gaspar de la Cruz. These 2 men, at 1555 and 1585, in their journals, have mentioned about tea as a popular drink in the East. The only person who mentioned before them, and who did not describe it as a tea, but as a colored water due to the green leaves that were thrown into hot water, was Marco Polo. before them. So Marco Polo and these two people mention about the tea. But the important thing is, how on earth did the rest of this zone start to grow tea? Because at the stage that we were talking about, till this moment, all of the tea was coming from China. China was the one and only monopoly, it was the only grower, and they were responsible of all of the tea. British, when they colonized India after 1660s, at the same time when this Dutch trade started, they got introduced to the tea too. But they got introduced to the tea with diplomatic sources and when some British traders went to China to be able to get material. These British traders were mainly related to one very big company, a superpower of that time, and actually a sort of a dangerous company. They were called the East Indian Company, and East Indian Company was completely British capital. They grew so big in the history at the stage that they had a 280,000 men-powered army of their own. They had their own railways, they had their own trains, and they had their own countries. For example, with the money that came in from the trade, they bought today's Singapore, and they colonized it. And that is the history of Singapore with the British people, or the history of English being spoken in Singapore for national language. It is known that this company was so powerful that it wanted to break the Chinese monopoly on tea. And they bought a great deal of land, property in India. The climate was okay, the land was big enough, tea was right next door, it just needed to come because India didn't have tea. And they missioned a botanist, a British botanist, whose name was Robert Fortune. And Robert Fortune spied for the British, going to China, saying that as a botanist, as a scientist, an explorer, he wanted to do some experiments, explore, but he took tea leaves and tea bush seeds with him to India, where in the region of Assam, the Indians started to grow tea. And in a very short while in history, in a period of something like half a century, 50 years time, British in India started to grow a big quantity of tea. Today, in the world, all over the world, 30%, approximately 1/3 of all of the tea that is drunk is coming from China. Right after China, it's India. 20% of the tea that is drunk all over the world is coming from India. So that's 50% together, half of the tea that we have. All of the rest, the other half, is coming from all of these tea-growing countries that you see over here. And when you pay attention to the map, generally what you see as dark green is where black tea is grown or popular. For that reason, there's a big market for that, and that's what they grow. For example, Russia and Turkey, as we mentioned a little while ago, they're crazy for black tea. It's the black tea that they are, related with. The green is green tea, as we know, and the phosphoric color is yellow tea. Actually, yellow tea was discovered accidentally. It was a sloppy way of treating the green tea that turned out to give the yellow tea result, but some nations, some people, some groups liked it, and they continued, working on it. The important thing about it is all of them is coming from one certain plant. And that plant is something that we know from relaxing tea most of the time, when we prefer it that time, Camellia. Camellia sinensis is known as the tea plant itself. And all of the tea, either they're black or green or yellow, comes from the same plant. It is actually the way the tea leaves are treated that gives us the result of the black tea or the green tea or the yellow tea. Black tea is the tea leaves being roasted after fermentization. So they're fermented, they're oxided. And due to that reason, they also give a very dark red or black color. While the green tea is not oxided, it's not fermented. And it is left to moisture and afterwards dry. In the ancient China time, before the Tang dynasty, between those 2000 BC and 600 AD period, tea was used as a very important subject of currency. They used to make pies or bricks from dried tea, and when somebody needed change or need to give money back after a valuable purchase, they broke that, brick and gave you back change. Some of them, for uses in big cities like old-time Shanghai, was already scrawled, so it was easier to break, like some biscuits we buy today in the supermarket. It is known that the green tea is preferred without sugar. All of the countries that are national countries of green tea drinkers, like Chinese, they don't put sugar in it. Sometimes they sweeten it with natural honey, but generally they don't prefer any sweet at all. While the black tea is completely opposite. Black tea is always prepared with sweetness. And so sugar, honey, the Russians prepare vishna jam, or marmalade made from sour cherries. They put like a spoon of the thick marmalade of cherry or vishna into their black tea. It is a very well-known, winter drink. Especially if it's very cold, they also add vodka to it. But that's another thing. They believe that vodka cures everything, just like rakia does in Serbia, So that is one case. But black tea is used with sweet and with milk. The matter of milk is an interesting thing. Do you know why the British drink tea with milk? Do you have an idea why British drink the tea with milk? Now, one of the first things that was brought out as a strong idea, and that makes sense, was after the tea ritual was introduced to the British, we will come to that, when they were using their very elite porcelain cups and saucers, they were very, very thin, porcelain and china. And pouring hot, very hot, steamy water directly to it, especially if it was winter time in Britain, would crack that porcelainware. And those were very, very valuable. So to be able to avoid this, first a bit of milk was put into the, cup, and then the tea was poured on top of that milk, so the hot would not immediately, go into relationship with the porcelain to crack it or to break it. Okay, it sounds reasonable, but why milk? You can put a bit of cold water and do the same thing, right? Why milk? Where did the British learn how to drink tea?
From Portuguese.
No,
India.
from Portuguese, but in India.
Uh-huh.
And in India, when they brought the tea from China, and when they grew their own tea, and when they had the tea, they had the tea. They had to drink it. You need one more thing to drink tea: water, which India did not have. Drinking water, which India did not have, and is still a very serious problem in India. Due to that reason, they boiled milk and brewed the tea in the milk, because that was the safe liquid to drink in India. They got so used to the taste that after they brought it at 1700s back home to Britain, and when they had safe water, and they drank it with the water, something was missing. I mean, something was not exactly like it used to taste. Two things were missing: the sugar and the milk. So the British tradition of drinking tea with milk was created by adding milk to the water tea this time to make it taste like what it was in India, and sugar that was necessary, which brought a completely different trade this time from Africa all the way to Europe, the sugar cane, trade. And this created much more colonization, because all of the European countries that actually had good and strong sea power, or navies, like the Dutch, like the Norwegians, like the Portuguese, this time started to have colonies in Africa. because from here they were bringing the tea, they were bringing the silk, they were bringing the porcelain, they were bringing salt, but sugar was in Africa, and they had to bring the sugar this time, the sugar canes. But the tradition of drinking tea and milk is due to that unsafeness of the water in India. That is an important case. That is a fact to keep in mind. Now, if I have not bored you, is it interesting?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, then I want to pass to this one thing, the samovar. Now, these samovars are either Ottoman, Turkish related at the time of the Turkish Empire, or Russia related to the time of the Tsars. And the very first ones that were made for the imperial families, Ottoman or Russian imperial families. You all know the answer to that. They were created to make tea. Who was drinking the tea at 16th, 17th century? The high classes only, the imperial environment, the entourage. And the Russian ones, for this reason, were made from silver, and they had the seal of the Russian Tsar on them. The Ottomans were made from tombak, which actually is a type of a bronze that is gold gilded, so it is gold polished, and it had the seal of the Ottoman Sultan on it. That is why today, when they exist, they are incredibly valuable for the antique dealers. Any other object, an antique dealer who is experienced will guess the period. But a real samovar, he will just look on it and he will say, oh, this is from the time of Nikolai II because it has his seal. Or this is from the time of Sultan Mehmed II because it has its seal on top of it. Samovars were used, as I've described a little while ago, and as you will see, made up one in a few minutes over there, to boil the water down here and to brew the tea up here. This must not touch the fire. The tea leaves over there in the hot water must let themselves loose, and the water, the hot water, because of the sort of a little chimney inside the samovar. Everybody saw a samovar over here, right? As it is a part of Balkan culture too, either from Russian or Ottoman influence. At least everybody's mother or father, if not grandparents, must have used a samovar for sure. And in some tea houses that are traditionally Balkan, I haven't come up to one yet in Belgrade, but there are many in Sarajevo, of course, and there are many in Albania. They are still used. They are still in use. Now, what is important is this. Today, in the village house, anywhere in the Black Sea coast, in Romania when they're drinking tea, in Georgia when they're drinking tea, but especially in between Romania and Georgia, which happens to be Turkey, this is the way tea is drank. This is brought from the stove. This has water inside it, and it was on the fire, while this one was placed on top of it with the tea leaves. And usually they use a little equipment, actually a sort of a glazer, to be able to leave the tea leaves or the little powder over here for it not to continue leaving its aroma and creating bitterness in the coffee, in the tea, excuse me. And this color, which is the targeted color, the goal, the color that you have to reach, by the Turks is called rabbit blood. Rabbit blood or bunny blood. It is usually when people go into a coffee house in the village, they do not order like 2 teas or 2 chais. They actually order 2 rabbit blood, which is 2 well-brewed tea, you know? Now, the thing is, the glasses. I'll tell you about the glasses when I'm serving you, because one of the ladies working over here, to our luck, was in Istanbul for a holiday a couple of months ago, and she brought a set for herself. She didn't know the set that she was buying is a bride set. It is a special set that when a boy with his family goes in the countryside part of Turkey to a house to ask the household to give their daughter as a bride to him, he brings this type of a set. It has to be from silver. This one is imitation, of course. And that silver set is what the girl is supposed to brew tea with and serve the people. So she can show that she's ready to be an household of herself, or a woman of her own house, being able to prepare the right tea in the right way and serve it the right way. The shape of the glasses, if you noticed, is interesting. They are in tulip shapes. And tulips happen to be a symbol of the Turks for a very, very long time. Today you relate it a lot with Holland, with Amsterdam, but the ones who introduced it, just like tea being introduced from royals to royals and making it big in Europe, tulips also was introduced from imperials in Persia when they had only wild tulips. They were called anemon, to the Turkish royal family as an imperial flower to decorate the palaces, like Topkapı Palace. And one of those sultans, actually a very important one, Suleiman the Magnificent, had the idea to introduce it as a gift, to present it as a gift to the Dutch ambassador of Constantinople. That's the way tulips made it to Amsterdam. But the thing is, the tulip glasses is important, and if you notice, even a lady in the village, when she's serving, she doesn't fill it completely, because the top is where you're supposed to hold it from. It doesn't have any handle. Modern ones today have handle, or if they have silver, decoration like the ones you will see, they have handle. But in a village coffee house, or in anywhere traditional, in Istanbul, if you're served tea still, they come in these glasses and there's nowhere to hold. For that reason, they always come with their little saucer, which you have to hold in your hand, because you can hold it from this little part just to bring it to your mouth and take a sip. But you can't hold it anymore in your hand. It will start burning, and you will place it on the saucer. So you hold it with the saucer. Arabs and the Turks are known to be able to drink this tea extremely hot. Let me give you this idea. Smoke is coming out. When they finish, in 3 or 4 sips, the smoke is still coming out of the glass. And if they have a foreign guest, for example, from Europe, they are still waiting for the tea to cool down so they can take the first sip. But we call those Arab lips in the Middle Eastern part, that they don't burn. They're used to heat because of drinking tea so hot. Now, there are other traditions of tea that is preferred in other countries. I will continue from where we left the history, not to bore you a lot with the history, I stopped at that part, but what did happen after Portuguese brought that tea from Macau to Europe? Who introduced it to the British? As you said, it was Portuguese.
Some Portuguese princess or something.
Absolutely. Catarina from Braganza,
Yes.
who married Charles II. We will come there and we will take after that, but first we'll give a little Turkish tea break, and I will also give you an idea of, if you wish, if you don't prefer the Turkish tea, because they're available over here, to drink Earl Grey, the British style, because they have Earl Grey bags and there's hot milk, so you can actually use your saucers, and way the British colonizers in India did, brew your tea in the milk and then add the hot water on top of it, which will make you a splendid British tea for a high afternoon tea or tea time, tea in Britain. And there is, in their own reservoirs, Japanese tea. The only thing is you will need to use an espresso cup, but to make it original, use both hands, not the handle, because Japanese use these teacups with no handle also, and they hold it with both hands, and they drink their chai that way. When we come back, I'll also tell you why tea in half of the world is chai, and in the other half of the world is tea. Now, if there's 110 countries, they speak 90 different languages. And these 110 countries that speak 90 different languages, let's say for bread, have, if not 90, 80 different words. But for tea, there's only 2 words. Chai, chai, cha, or tea, te, tara, but always the same root. We'll talk about that. Would you like to join me for some tea?
Yes.
A complete set of 6. So we have 6 over here, and they're silver decorated, as you can see from the glasses. This is a typical tulip-shaped, Turkish tea glass. It's used a lot in the Balkans. If you go to an Albanian or a Bosnian çay ocak, as they call, tea house, it is the same. This idea of creating an envelope for it, this is called an envelope, just placing the letter, like placing the letter into the envelope, you place the tea glass into this envelope. For the royals it was made from gold, and for the lower class, but who were merchants, it was made from silver, and they all had, like these copies too, an Ottoman Sultan seal on top of them. Now the major thing is, either you use the 2 kettles, the big one for water or the small one, or you use a samovar, a traditional one, or an old one like this. By this time, this tea must have found its color, we're hoping, keep fingers crossed, and you pour the tea into the cup, approximately 2/3 of it, and 1/3 you are filling up with hot water. So the tea is ready, and you can help yourselves with sugar outside. Let me start from the first one over here. The traditional way of making this for a person who is running a tea house is they actually will place all of these side by side. Let me show you, because this might be interesting for you. All 5. He will put hot water into this one, swirl it, then pass to this one, then to this one, and go on like that. This is to make sure that all of the glasses are hot, and they all have warmed up. After that, he will start from the furthest one and pour the tea up to 2/3. Imagine them doing this with 10 or 20 or 30 cups all day long. Okay, we will take care of this. So first, these cups. I'm filling it because they have the handles this time. And this tea that is over here, when it's black tea, both for Russians or for the Turks or the Balkan countries who have the tradition, Albanians mainly, you can brew 2 to 3 times. I wouldn't brew it the 3rd time, but 2 times it can actually go very well. And when I do it the 2nd time, I actually will also put a little bit more, probably like 1 more spoon of the tea to it.
And you said it is English black tea, right? This tea.
This tea is
Yes.
black tea, yes.
But why did you put extra water in it? Is it like a custom to put an extra water, or do you have to put it?
Because it's very strong.
Because it's strong.
Because it's
It's
strong.
very strong. If you like it very strong, you can drink it directly, but it will be very bitter if you don't add that water. Some people who drink a lot of tea all day long, for example the Turks, generally the Turks as coffee people,
Yeah.
but Turks drink coffee very rarely and for certain occasions, like maybe 2 times a day, their Turkish coffee. But all day long they will drink tea. And because they're using such a big quantity of it, also for it not to affect the body that much, they dilute it with water. Most of the Turks will drink it half-half, especially if it's the 2nd boil, like this is going to be. Please help yourselves 5 minutes later when it's ready, or when you're out, if you wish. But please help yourselves, ladies first, with these pieces over here. And if any of you would like to make Earl Grey the British way, over there in the tea box there are the Earl Grey teas. Put into one of the teacups or coffee cups hot milk, and put the Earl Grey tea into that hot milk and brew the bag like we do in the water in the milk. Afterwards, add the water up as you want it, how much milk you want, half, 1/3, or a quarter, and then take the bag out. So the bag may be 20 seconds, 30 seconds in the milk, and about 20, 30 seconds in the water will remain. Then you can add sweet if you want. That will be the traditional way of making the British tea, especially if you put the milk first, not to crack your valuable saucers. Today we don't have that problem because the porcelain or the china is not handmade and it's not coming from China unless you have a good set from your grandmother or your grandfather. Shall we meet in the room in 5 minutes? Okay, if anybody needs anything or help them amount. If you want to hear about a country that puts extreme amount of sugar into their tea, then I can give you an example of the Moroccans. If you have ever had Moroccan mint tea, or if you have been as a tourist to Morocco, unless you tell them, you will be served like a sherbet or like a honey. More than the tea, you will taste the sugar because they put so much sugar inside it. But mint tea is another tradition. Actually, those are all infusions. Tea is mainly the black tea, the green tea, and the yellow tea. Everything that comes from the plant, the Camellia sinensis. The rest, like nana, or like mint, spearmint, they are different plants and they are not tea actually. Nor is fruit tea, of course. But because of the way it is served and the tradition that it comes in the bags in the modern day, we refer to them as fruit teas or traditional teas, but generally they are not tea.
The terminology here in Serbia is mixing everything because you have the same word for both tea and herbal teas. There's only one word. Chai.
Yeah, for example, in Poland also, like for black tea they say herbate, and for green tea they say herbate, and for fruit tea they say herbate. It's only herbate, While in Chinese culture, Asian culture I should say, because all the way from China to Middle East, like Iranians, Persians, or people of Iran today, Turks, they have different names for them. They won't call them all chai. They will give different names to them.
I have one question.
Of course.
It's known that the green and the black tea are good for the health. They have some health benefits, but I heard that when you put milk in tea, it loses those health benefits.
It does.
So that's true.
It does. It breaks it, so that alertness, for example, it is giving. One of the major reasons why it became such a popular drink among the Buddhist monks is the fact that it was keeping them awake and alert. So they were able to do their meditation without falling asleep, because it is very difficult not to fall asleep if you ever have been in a meditation or joined a meditation or watched a meditation, because you actually put almost all of your body actions into a relenting mood, but you have to stay awake. That is actually like exactly the form the body has when we're sleeping, but we are sleeping. What they're doing is sleeping the body without sleeping. So tea became a very, very important discovery, and that's why Japanese monks were so delighted about it that they took it all the way to Japan and made it a ceremonial Japanese tea service due to that fact of tea. Tea, green tea, black tea, their effect on health, what they are good for, what they are not good for, I will mention to you in a few minutes. But milk breaks that, that's true. Milk breaks that, especially if you use it with the black tea, because black tea is the most awakening one. You don't put milk in green tea anyway, it is like a no-no, definitely no-no. You never use black tea with... Let's see if it is in its color.
Green tea.
Green tea,
No, in Serbia, no.
coffee.
Coffee, yes.
But today in the modern world, we're talking about modern coffee, right? I mean,
But we drink so-called Turkish traditional.
yeah, Bosnian or Greek or Turkish, it's all the same.
And
yeah.
yogurt.
Yeah,
And sour milk, yes.
Oh yeah, you drink yogurt a lot
Yes.
also for breakfast, I
Yes,
noticed,
yes.
because you have this tradition of starting the day with a börek or a börek. In Greece or in Turkey, the two backgrounds I'm coming, as I'm an interesting mixture, you know, a Turkish-Greek mixture, börek is a very popular thing, but we never eat it as often as you do. It is a once in a while thing, you know, like you feel like a börek, you ask your grandmother or mother to make it, or your girlfriend to make it, or you make it if you can make it, but it's like once a week thing or something. We can never eat börek every single day. But when I was in Macedonia, I realized that every single person was eating börek at least once every day, either at breakfast or at lunch, but everybody had börek once every day. And this is amazing, you know, to see how you don't become like Americans, you know. But
It's a little bit different here. I think we eat more of a kind of pita kind of things than burek on a average week basis. It's like homemade or something bought from
in Serbia, yes, I saw them consuming börek more in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Albania, Macedonia too. Macedonia, they eat a lot of börek, but over here, not that much, even though you have it everywhere. It is seen everywhere, you know. Now, let me continue and a little bit with the historical point of view from where we left it, because that will be able to give you a good idea. We said the Portuguese brought the tea from China to the Middle East and from the Middle East to Europe. When this was all happening, of course, Spain and Hispanic-related countries, as the Portuguese kingdom and the Spanish Empire at that time were very much arm in arm, were the ones who started to consume the tea. But again, as a very valuable material, because it was nothing that was to be within the reach of ordinary people or middle-class people. Not talking about the villagers at all. We're talking about the city people or the merchants' families and all of those. But the interesting thing is, let's forget this for the moment and turn back to our actually map over here. That will give you a good idea. When the Dutch and the British started to compete for the trade, something interesting happened, and that was who was going to take the tea first to Europe. They forgot about the Portuguese. The Portuguese had already, you know, discovered the merchandise in Macau, and they set on their way to Middle East, turning all around Africa. They were the years that the British had a very, very powerful naval force, and Russia and the Russian Tsars had a very powerful army and a great advantage of being neighboring the Chinese territory. There was already an ancient trade route, the Silk Route, so if the Silk Road was used, maybe bringing the tea to Europe or to the West would be easier than bringing it from the other way all around the water, when there were no steam engines, when they depended on the wind and the ships of that time, of course. Actually, this started such a competition in the naval business that the fastest trade ship of the 16th and the 17th centuries, called Clipper, was discovered because of the competition the Dutch and the British had, who was going to bring the material faster. Because they were bringing the same material, they were bringing the same silk, they were bringing the same porcelain, they were bringing the same tea, but who was to bring it first was going to make most of the money. Russia wanted to get a step ahead of them, and they decided to do it by land. It was their one and only attempt. They did succeed, but it took more than a year, and it was not worth all of the money that was spent, and the income was not that big. But this brought one thing to the Western world, some people say, and some people say it is another reason, which I'm going to share with you too. When the Russians loaded their camels and all of those, actually there were these people in between whom was working for the Russians as the middlemen. So they were the Uyghurs in the north of China. Then there were the Mongols. Then there were the Kazakhs. Then there were the Uzbeks. All those countries today we know that separated from Soviet Union at that time were the pupils or the subjects of the Russian Tsars. So everybody took in their territories, neighboring country border, the valuables and brought to the other border. These were merchants and they had their share of the, merchandise. When they were doing this, the valuables, don't forget, silk, porcelain, china, and tea was put into boxes. The porcelain ones were marked and they were much heavier and it was very, very fragile. So those had to be taken special care. But silk and tea was both light and they were in very similar boxes. So when they were changing hand from one merchant to the other, it always was important to identify them. Which boxes had, the tea, which boxes had the silk. And this was controlled by the Russian merchants, whom were trying to get a role in the game, like the British and the Dutch. So, at that time, this liquid that we're talking about, the second most popular liquid in the world after water, it is consumed that much. After water in the world, the most drank, liquid is tea, no matter which type you prefer, today's world. Russians had to put a mark, and the only name it was known at that time was chai, or chai, which came from matcha, the very first form that they were eating, as I told you, like a porridge. So, the word or the sound chai in Russian is spelled differently. You would know much better than me. Like writing the name of Tchaikovsky, There is a T at the beginning. The sound was cha, so the Russian merchants put a T on those boxes to recall to the name. And those tea boxes were delivered all the way to Odessa, today Ukraine, and then they were shipped to Constantinople, where they made it to the world. But they came as the tea boxes. Due to this reason, the material inside was called tea in the areas that it was received. This makes sense, even if it is not true, because there's no historical evidence, there's no proof to this. Sounds good to the ear. Another one, in my opinion, that makes a little bit more sense is when Princess Catarina from Brangaza, the Portuguese princess, married Charles II, she came with a big amount, an unbelievable amount of dowry. If at that time there was things like, TVs, fashion TV, CNN News, or, celebrity news, it will be probably more illuminating than Princess Diana's wedding years ago. Within this story, there was a good deal of gold. There was a lot of fabric material, silk, which was given as dowry by her father and her family, the Portuguese imperial family, to herself. And there were chests, 3 chests of tea, the finest kind. She came with that tea, and she had already grown up with the tradition of, like every elegant Portuguese, tea habit. She introduced that tea habit, including what type of a cup you drink the tea with, what type of a saucer you drink it with, how you prepare it, and she taught all of her servants. And of course, all of the elite women that was in her entourage immediately took the habits of the new queen, and it became a royal symbol. It became sort of a must of the Queen's entourage, and it made its place into the British life, which today makes Britain like the first one to come into the mind, tea countries with its tea tradition. After all, it's not a British thing. It was introduced by a Portuguese princess, and it was due to that Portuguese princess's habit. If she didn't like tea, but if she liked coffee, maybe England will be a coffee country today, and they wouldn't have that, tea culture that they do have.
And she drank tea with some cookies and sweets, so it was like...
Now, the thing is, that is Anna. That is the 7th Duchess of Bedford at the 1700s, about half a century after Princess Katarina, or Queen Katarina, as she became. Anna, due to the royal life at that time, having like a 2-supper system every day, a late breakfast and then late dinner, there was a long gap in between. And Duchess Anna was a person who was getting hungry. So she created herself like this afternoon tea habit, which among her environment she called high tea. That is why the British call tea time also high tea, because there is some food served with the tea to be able to keep them full and to tolerate them until the dinner. It was a practical solution she found, and as an aristocrat, of course, she created this way, or advised this way to her servants, of serving them in what now elite patisseries have, those 2 or 3 story service tables with the cookies on the top, sandwiches at the bottom, and that way. The after tea became common and started to be used by the general public. The people started to use this tea habit, but they used it with a scone, like the British do, hard cake, and cream, like your kaimaki or coated cream. And that was their simple solution, and they called it low tea, because they couldn't have high tea like the elite, they were having low tea. So Duchess Anna's solution is like a personal, touch that made it into the history, just like Lord Sandwiches, as all of you might know. He was a great gambler, and he didn't want to leave the gambling table because he was afraid his hand would change, and so he was addicted to gambling, but he was not eating. He was starving. He was getting hungry. He came with this idea of asking his butler to put something between 2 slices of bread and bring it. It was named after him as Sandwich, because he was Lord Sandwich. So is Earl Grey tea. Earl Grey tea is the idea of placing bergamot skin or peeled bergamot rashes with a few drops of the fruit itself into dry tea leaves and wait them for them to get that aroma, which is created by Earl Grey of England. And the tea became so popular and made it all over the world. A lot of people like Earl Grey, that it became the Earl Grey tea. Bergamot was at that time's Europe, we're talking about when Earl Grey was living at early 1800s, only a fruit that grew in southeastern Mediterranean, from Cyprus to Italy, you can say, and he had his from Italy. He imported them from Italy. He liked them so much that he was using it to be able to blend his own tea, which was later becoming Earl Grey tea. Now, when we are talking about all of this that is taking place, there is something interesting. Of course, British brought the tea when the Russians failed with that attempt, bringing it over land. The ones who were able to do it after the Portuguese was the British. Portuguese were the first, but the ones who made a big business out of it were the British, because their population happened to love tea. And it became such an addiction that the British were spending an enormous amount of money for their tea. They were trading with China the tea with silver. So from the treasury of the Great British Empire, an enormous number of silver, an enormous amount of silver was being brought to China. British sat down and said, this can't continue like this. were going to get bankrupt because of tea. Because at this time, a lot of things changed. At 1717, a person called Thomas Twining started to open the first tea houses where the Victorian ladies were allowed to sit. And as women, mainly, especially from the aristocrat class, were not women of career, but free with a lot of leisurely time, these tea houses started to fill amazingly. The Twinings tea houses still exist in UK, maybe you know. And if you ever travel to Southeast Asia, in countries like Thailand, in countries like, you know, Taiwan, in the big shopping malls, there are Twinings tea parlors. They are like a very elite, you know, patisseries, expensive for the local people over there, but usually expats, the foreigners who are working in Thailand or living in Thailand make use of them. Well, that's the tradition of what this person, Thomas Twining, started at 1717. And if it's not the parlors, all of you know the Twining tea bags, of course, because they're as famous as Lipton, maybe the second biggest brand of UK that bags the tea. Now the thing is, with this being introduced and tea getting into the middle class people's life too, British really had to find a solution. And they found a solution which was much less dangerous for themselves, because nobody in England knew about it. And it would cut from the transport cost too, plus it would keep all of their silver in the treasury. They were growing a lot of opium in India. So why not trade the tea of the Chinese with the opium? There was one problem. The Chinese population, which was a very, very good target in quantity, I'm talking about, didn't have the habit of opium. Only their higher class did, because it was not easy to reach. So British, and especially that company that I mentioned about, that makes it one of the first evil companies of the world business history, the East India Company, sent spies and did a promotion campaign to get the Chinese addicted to opium. And China accepted to trade its tea in turn of opium. So the British, just from next door, India, had to bring the, you know, opium to the Chinese and get the tea and transport it to the world. At this time, their wealth was increasing, their colonizations were increasing, and their colonies all over Africa, including South Africa, all over Americas, and especially North America, started to increase. So for the British, there were new tea markets. While for the Chinese, the silver was cut, all of them were addicted to opium, and half of the population was like useless. It became such a serious thing in the big cities that the Chinese Empire and the royals this time sat down, like the British did when they were losing the silver. We have to bring a stop to this. This can't continue this way. And at 1839, the imperial family's minister declared to England that they are no longer accepting opium for their tea. They want to turn back to currency, to silver. British said no. Chinese said we wouldn't give you tea. The British had tea orders from all over the world. They needed the tea. So what is known in the history as the Opium Wars, a lot of people think that is because of opium, or it is a war for the opium. On Chinese case, it was to get rid of the opium. And in Britain's case, it was to continue forcing them to buy the opium. So at 1839 the first, then they have a pact for a while, and then at 1850s the second, opium wars took place. These are very important in Chinese history because it took Imperial China 100 years back in wealth and in poverty and in economical, disaster. And the British gained from it, of course. Now, one of the major things is, when all of this was happening over there and the struggle was continuing on, tea started to make its way, as it did from Asia to Africa and Europe, this time to the new continent, to the Americas. And it was first brought over there by a Dutchman, whose name you will know from another addictive, merchandise. Peter Stuyvesant. Everybody will remember from the cigarettes. Peter Stuyvesant is one of the first tobacco dealers of American history. And the interesting thing is he is also the first person to bring tea into what we call today United States, when it was a Dutch colony. New York today, old name of my city, is New Amsterdam. And until the British took over, it was known as New Amsterdam. To that New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant brought tea. And he found a very, very good market in the city for the tea. So he started giving more orders back home to the Dutch Indian Company, which was also competing with, you know, the East India Company of the British. They were both big, but due to all of the dirty fight that they led, the East Indian Company was way ahead. Let me put it this way, like in America's business schedules, it was like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. The Dutch company owned like 25% of the market. The East India Company, which was British, with had its own army, with had some countries that it bought, like Singapore, I told you, owned 75% of the market. But it continued. And something interesting happened around the year 1740s. This time, another gentleman whose name was Sullivan created something that we never gave up. We loved it so much that it is still a very important part of our daily lives. Sullivan created the tea bag by accident. I mean, not for them to be used as tea bags. He was a tea merchant, and he was selling tea to cafes and restaurants of 18th century America, in cities like New York, New Orleans, where there was the cafe culture. But to the restaurants and cafes, he had to give samples. So he was putting a certain amount of his finest tea into these little silk bags, which he was tying with a silk thread, and he was presenting them that way. And people were giving him orders continuously, a lot of orders. And he was sending them, but he was asked for more samples and more samples. He said, "You like the tea, you're asking for more orders, I send you the orders, why do you still want the samples?" He couldn't find a solution, answer to this, so he went to see the restaurants and cafes where he, sent the samples. And he realized that the business orders, without pouring that tea from those silk bags into the cup or to the pot, they were using them directly with the silk, because silk was letting them, infuse. Plus, it was not leaving the roots and the powder in the glass. It was like holding it itself. So he said, this is a very good idea. And he created his own idea, and actually he progressed his own idea and started to make tea bags, this time from fabric, like cotton, because silk would be very expensive. That was his delicate sample. So he started using cotton from low quality cotton that was manufactured around the New Orleans area, or the south of the United States, where the cotton fields was plenty and slavery was still in practice, so labor was cheaper than anything. There was no labor. So he made deals with some of the cotton fields owners, and he created his first tea bags. The idea of coming to iced coffee was another American's idea. His name was Thomas Blachin, and the First World War, after the Americas had their independence from the Dutch, the French, and the British, when it was taking place at the early 1800s, on a warm summer day, and when they prepared all this tea to sell to the crowds, they realized, due to the fact that it was so hot, nobody was drinking tea, as they're not Middle Eastern, of course. And the fact was, all the tea was going to be wasted. There was no money to be made from a big calculation that they had made to gain profit. So this Blachin decided to bring big urls with a lot of ice inside them and pour the tea on those ices. As a refreshment, it started to sell like peanuts, and iced tea, as we know today, was created. Just waiting the already brewed tea and pouring it over the ice. Then different versions of it, the way of coloring it, the way of fruiting it, giving the aromas, preparing the Florida sunset tea and all of the others giving it a little bit of flavor with some peppermint or mint or other, objects, slicing orange or lemon into them, even fruit like peach or juicy fruit that will give it a flavor, that gave Lipton all that idea to create that variation that today the kids are crazy about, which the children are crazy about.
Or is it because of the sugar?
Yeah, that's another thing, of course, because iced tea was served already with sugar at that time a lot. And sugar was something that was making addiction too, obviously. The idea of serving the iced tea without sugar was an individual preference which the households or elderly people, or especially after healthy living got into our lives, like after 1970s, we can say, started to be popular. Before that, you wouldn't think about iced tea without sugar. Now, from this trade and the way that this trade actually came, I'm turning back to the same picture, but just to ask you, because I'm going to pass to something a little bit more specific, the national approach. The way tea came from ancient China to Europe, and the way it made from Europe to England, and how in England it became a big, big business, and then how it was led to America by the British mainly, and a little bit by the Dutch, as I said, by Holland. Is there any question related to any of the steps that I took? Or is there a big jump or leap that I did? You want a little bit more detail related to this? One thing I'll tell about the things that I spoke with you. You remember we said one of the reasons why, while in the Eastern Hemisphere, the merchandise is called chai, the reason that it is called tea, te, over here is because of that tea the Russians put. The other explanation, which I find a little bit more believable, is again Princess Katerina from Braganza. Because when she brought those tea chests that were given to her by her father, the King of Portugal, they were exactly in the same chests that the Portuguese sailors had brought them from Macau, from China. And on them in Spanish, what was written was Transporte de Herbata Aromática. Transporte de Herbata Aromática. If you don't count that the article is Transporte Herbata Aromática. T-E-A. And at that time, when it was long words like that, there was the general custom to take only the initials and read the initials as a word. So probably the stuff in England was immediately called tea, and from that to all English-speaking countries it passed as tea, which makes a good amount of sense, of course. Now, dear guests, dear friends, this picture is one we can start with. Who has been to Morocco? You haven't been to Morocco? Lovely country, beautiful country, a great deal of folklore. It is not Middle East, so be very, very, relaxed. It's a little bit Middle East, it's a little bit Mediterranean. It's not Europe at all, but it has an enormous influence, and it had enormously influenced Spain and Portugal because of the Andalus time. First the Moroccans for 300 years ruled Spain, then the Spanish for 150 years they took their revenge and they ruled Morocco. But this country has this tradition of serving mint tea. Otherwise, if you want tea, immediately this comes in front of you. And it is something so delicious, so alert, and making addiction that all of the Moroccan people are addicted to it. And for that reason, they're a little bit slow. Because it's mint, it's strong mint, and they drink zillions of cups every day. And it's not the flavor like the mint tea bags, it's the mint itself. They actually wash the tea glass with hot water like we did over there with the Turkish ones, and then they place a big bunch of nana, inside that glass, and then they pour the green tea that they already made. It's green tea, it's tea, but it has such a strong nana aroma, and they serve it maybe like with 1/3 of the glass with sugar. So 1/3 of the glass they put sugar. It's like honey. It's
like sugar with tea.
Now, in China and in India, they're generally many. In China, they say there's 1,500 different kinds of tea. But 3 of them are very well known because those 3 are introduced to the world by the European powers, by Dutch, British, Portuguese. The Yunnan tea, and that is originally the birthplace because Yunnan, Yunnan, is the place where 4,000 years ago this legendary emperor was sitting under the tree, and from the bushes a leaf came to his hot water. That is Yunnan. And the best tea of China comes from Yunnan property. Besides Yunnan, there is Ceylon, which was a part of the great imperial Chinese idea, but today it links to Sri Lanka, the country we know as Sri Lanka or Sri Lanka. And the third of that area's tea, we can say, is the Pacao tea. You might know this from the phrase orange Pacao tea or orange Pacao. It's usually tea bags in classy places. There's no orange in it. It has nothing to do with orange. It's just its name. That indicates the size of the leaves, because Pacao tea's leaves are bigger. They're a little bit like the orange tree's leaves instead of the bush, the tea bush. But it's from the same family. It's again Camellia sinensis, and it is tea. So these 3. When it comes to India, India's first place climate-wise and geographically with the richness of the soil that gave the British, don't forget, tea was grown in India only to break the monopoly of China by the British. So, and the habit of Indians drinking tea, like a masala or chai tea latte, is very new. It's from 1850s. First they grew it, they broke the monopoly of China, the British, then they exported it all over the world, and then they were looking for a new market, and they looked exactly where they were growing the tea. They said, these Indians are quite crowded. If we get them used to tea, we'll have a whole new market. Why don't we sell them to them? And they made the Indians addicted to tea. But the thing is, Assam is the first area. The second area is Darjeeling, as everybody knows that tea. It's a nice tea. It's a very well-known tea. And the third one is actually known as Crean tea, but nobody knows it as Crean because we're talking about exactly the thing I told to you 5 minutes ago. Standard, rich in flavor, black tea that was known to be, up till our day, since he decided to put a drop of bergamot flavor in it, Earl Grey tea. So the Assam, the Darjeeling, and the Earl Grey teas are Indian teas. Yunnan, Ceylon, and Pacao teas are Chinese teas. And these all together are covering like 50% of the tea market in the world. Which other sources are responsible of the other 50%? Approximately 39 countries. But 4 of them stand out. One of them is Japan, because you remember at the 6th century when the Buddhist monk Yansei took the tea, and the emperor liked it so much and encouraged the Japanese people to grow tea. Japan became a tea country, and they grow a good amount of tea, which is now competing in the world with approximately like 12% of the whole market. So it's a big amount. Then comes Russia. Russia has a good amount, and they're growing it generally around the Black Sea area, as there was a very serious problem with the sources of both Russia's and the Turks' Black Sea sources when the Chernobyl explosion took place about 2 decades ago, 20 years ago or something. Maybe some of you will remember. I was a university student at that time, so it must be more than 20 years. But the radioactivity that actually felt free and to be able to, circulate caused a great damage. And even in some territories, like Black Sea part of Turkey, the Turkish government at that time had abandoned the tea plants, and they actually warned the people not to drink the tea that was coming from that territory. Drink the Turkish tea that was coming from the Iran and the Syrian border, the more Arabic version, but not the Black Sea version, even though that is the one the Turks liked a lot. Soviets had a completely different approach. Their Minister of Culture, he himself drank a cup of the radioactive tea and said, see, nothing happened to me, so you can all drink it. And they continued drinking it. And that was the Soviet approach. Nothing happens to a Russian, or nothing happens to... so that was the thing. Iran has tea. Iran grows tea. Kenya in Africa, due to its high plants and moisturing, humid weather conditions, is able to grow good tea. And they started to grow a lot of tea after the colonization took it as a material to America, in Americas, of course. So in Florida and in New Mexico and areas where there is dampness, humidity, that is good for the, tea leaves to, get the flavor they want them to get. Tea is grown, and it became a major merchandise, one of the top products, we can say. Now,
Sorry, what about United Kingdom? Did they produce tea?
United Kingdom does not grow tea.
Does not grow tea
They
at
don't
all.
grow tea. No, not at all.
They
Not
cannot
at all.
because of
It's
climate.
Yeah, the
climate.
climate is not available.
So it is next to the India and China.
Yeah.
It's Japan, Russia, and what did you say else?
Oh, after Japan,
Yes.
the big powers in
Yes.
tea business. After Japan, we can say Russia.
Yes.
After Russia, we can say Ottoman Empire because it carried a lot of land. Now that's divided. When it was Ottoman Empire, probably after Russia, it was the fifth biggest source. China, India, Japan, Russia, Ottoman Empire. But now that Ottoman Empire is Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Cyprus, Balkan countries, Romania,
divided.
everybody grows their own tea. But as one country among all of them, still the one that grows most is Turkey. Because on the Black Sea coast of Turkey, Lipton, Twinings, Sir John Schellings all have factories and plants. So there must be a big production that is taking place over there. Kenya, Africa is new in the market. And something related to your question, which actually is a very good question, British being such a tea country and being addicted to tea and creating the tea culture and everything related with it, made a lot of money of tea, but never were able to grow it themselves due to their climate. And it was always a danger. It was always a danger because if it is a material that you are merchandising is not within your control of production, that is why all the opium wars took place. They wanted to control China. That's why they wanted to break the monopoly by colonizing India to be able to grow the tea over there. And when England, even now, like the most modern example I can give to you was when the British were backing your, of course it's not like old days, you don't back up an army, you back up in a certain way now, but when they were giving up Hong Kong to China a couple of years ago, one of the conditions in all of the pact that was signed between the Chinese government and the British government was the tea plants of Hong Kong remaining in British companies, processed for 99 more years. The same is done by the Portuguese for Macau, for example. It's interesting because that material is the most important thing for them, and they want to guarantee that they still have access to the material, they still have access to what is over there. Now, one thing I want to tell you that I haven't is, we said Iran is another source. In Iran, on the northeastern part, which is closer to the Turkish borders, they have an area called Lahiyan. If you ever find Iran tea in the market, or if you would like to taste it, Laiyan tea or Laiyan spring tea is the best Iranian or Middle Eastern tea that you can get. From the Black Sea coast, even though Russians have a very, very big percentage of producing, let's say from all of the Black Sea tea, Russians are producing like 70% of it, Turks are producing like 25% of it, and the other 5% is produced by Georgia or Romania or countries like that. The Turkish Rize tea, or Çaykur Rize, is the best, the very, very best. This is a Rize, but not Çaykur Rize. So this is like with the tea you tasted, or this tea leaves over here is like a commercial product, but not like what you would buy for yourself, you know, when you have the access. And there is, besides these, one more that I can actually share with you, Laiyan spring tea, the Turkish Rize tea. And in Taiwan, again, if we go back all the way to that geography, in Taiwan, Formosa tea. Formosa in Portuguese means the beautiful island. And that was the name they gave to Taiwan. So when they took Taiwan as a colony together with Macau, then they lost it to the Chinese. But when they were calling it Formosa, the tea plants were under the Portuguese control. And it was one of their three sources. Together with northern Cambodia, Macau, and Taiwan, Portuguese were taking the tea and bringing it to Europe. And they succeeded. They succeeded first when the Dutch and the British and the Russians were competing with each other and fighting who is going to bring the big quantity, first. The Portuguese in small quantities, one by one, they brought the tea. That's why they actually became the first ones who were able to make a wealth out of it. These are generally the points that I thought of sharing with you. I'll just look over here if there is anything we did not mention about. The Samawar we mentioned. Now this is the traditional way in a fast food chain in Tokyo, the way the standard Japanese tea ceremony takes place. If it is done by a geisha, or if it is done by a Japanese host that you are visiting in their home, you all will be sitting on the floor, and she will be right in the middle of you with the cups. The basics are the same, because in all of the tea culture, you have to put it into a warm cup for the temperature and the hot water immediately not to get a few degrees low. Why? Because you need to keep the water in a boiling, temperature for the tea leaves to be able to brew finely and give their aroma out. With small carefulnesses, like using a cold cup, waiting a little while before you get to the second, step. If you bring the water from 100 degrees Celsius to 80, 85 degrees Celsius, you will not have the same result. Your tea will not be good. So in the Japanese system too, the very first idea is to warm the cups. You can do it the Turkish, the Albanian way, by pouring hot water, then pouring them out, or you can keep the cups on steam, like the Japanese do. So the steam will keep the porcelain warm. So when the hot water is brought in, it will not bring down the temperature, which means the tea, the hot tea when it is poured in, and that is how the service is taking place in this photograph over here. Japanese tea, or Japanese chaya, or matcha, it's the same thing, is flavored. It is flavored, besides the tea leaves, with certain, other herbs they're using, but not as strong as the Indians. For example, Indian's tea or Malaysian tea has a lot of aroma and sweetness because as much as putting a lot of sugar into it, they also put cardamom, cinnamon, nutmegs, and things like this. While the Japanese don't. The Japanese will put a clove, for example. something small that gives an aroma that will change a bit but will not dominate the tea. The tea will still taste like tea. For the Indians, it's not important as long as it's sweet, water. For Tibetans, for example, you are drinking like a hot version of milk because their most favorite tea in Tibet is yak butter tea. They have these animals, yaks, like llamas, and they are very well known with their butter, which the Tibetans actually consume a lot. And when you're a visitor in Tibet, they force you to it, thinking for your good, because the yak butter is so strong, it actually keeps your blood pressure in a level for that attitude, because you're very high. So you do not feel less oxygen, and you do not feel the dizziness you normally do. Otherwise, I've seen a lot of people in Tibet, when they land, that spend the first 24 hours, maybe 2 days in bed. They have to change all their program and everything, because the height is so effective. But the yak butter avoids that. So all day long, the Tibet people put a piece of yak butter in a cup instead of the milk, pour the sweet tea, chai, on top of that, mix it, so they have this creamy, tea. It's like tea with skimmed milk, like strong milk, not the milk we drink.
What about the health benefits of that tea with butter? Is it the same thing like with milk? You have no health benefits? Or,
from the tea itself, yeah, you are right, because the butter itself plays an important role in that matter we mentioned about, but the teas, for example, major alerts like keeping you awake doesn't exist because you're using a dairy product which is quite heavy. Reminding me of the fact, tea, black tea, as it is preferred by the West, when all this trade was taking place and when all the British and the Dutch were controlling, the tea that they were selling to the West was always black tea. Green tea never made it big in the West unless it was pumped with some health reasons after 1970s, and a lot of people started to drink green tea because green tea is healthier. The black tea was the material that caused the craziness. And black tea's benefits are this. Black tea is a digestive, first of all. It settles the stomach. That's why in ancient Greece, even though that was never scientifically proved, they even believed that it was a contract for poisoning. Like the god of agriculture in that legend, had the poisonous taste and he drinks tea and he gets well. They're referring to the fact that it settles the stomach and eases his pain. But it's not something as an anti, solution for poisoning. But we do know that tea keeps you awake. Tea keeps you alert. For that reason, the Buddhist monks, grabbed it and they never let it go. It is still all over the Buddhist world the most important, drink of the Buddhists, especially the Zens. The Zens gave their own spirituals to tea drinking. Like the Chinese tea service, there is the Zen tea service, and it's a whole spiritual fact. The monk, after becoming a certain level, is able to have access to the tea, like the Japanese geisha girl, and it has its own ceremony and everything. But black tea is believed to be, if it is not consumed in enormous materials like it is done, for example, in Albania or in Turkey, but if it is kept at a certain level, is believed to be good for heart, because it's good for veins, it actually keeps the veins open, and that's why it avoids heart attacks. Green tea is very, very calming. Green tea is more like a depression pill, Instead of taking a pill, you can have a cup of green tea or 2 cups of green tea to calm yourself down. Due to that reason, it is also a very, very popular, relaxing drink. But all of this is due to the experiments and the researches that are done on tea, and these are like the benefits of tea. But if you ask me personally, They are to be able to create what is good about this all-time very valuable merchandise, the consuming product. If you add a few, it's like decorating the material. If you look for disadvantages in black tea and green tea, I can tell you, as well as the good points, you can also find those. Just like it was with coffee, First, that was also because of trade. The coffee consumption, especially in the United States, after the United States became free from Britain and Netherlands and France, they grabbed the coffee because their sources were much closer to them, South America, and tea was something British, so they wanted to refuse the British identity. They wanted an American identity, and they grabbed coffee and they made America a coffee drinking nation. That changed like in the last 50 years, again with tea consumption and the tea companies' advertisements and efforts started to give its fruit, of course, so they balanced the situation. But first coffee was brought with a lot of, and that was the British tea companies and all that said coffee is bad for you, coffee shortens life, coffee makes heart attacks. 20 years later, some doctors came out and said coffee is very good for you, you have to have coffee. So you never know those bits, of course. You never know those bits.
I have a question. Are
Yes,
there any
you can-
tips, regarding the way how we can determine the quality of the chai?
Now, I would say try to buy tea, that's how I do to cafes or bistros if I'm responsible of them, as leaves, not powder. Try to stay away from powder as much as possible, because powder is used for the most commercial tea. And that most commercial tea, unless you buy nice tea leaves or good quality tea and ground it yourself and make it powder, that's okay. But the powder that is in the Lipton tea bags, Twinning tea bags, or the tea bags you buy in your country, that is actually the
Mixture.
worst of worst tea, because the highest quality tea is usually marketed as tea leaves or in different emballages and whatever is left out, so the competition between Lipton, Twinings and Nestle or the other brands that own tea is like who gets the best of the worst, tea. Try to get tea leaves, that's the first thing. Do get the tea leaves. Another thing is aromas and flavor. Like before we brewed that tea, I passed it around and I made you smell it. That is a good tea, not average tea, not an excellent tea, as I told you. There's a higher quality of that. But the tea must have its aroma. It must have its, even when it's dry, before it is related with the water at all, it must give you that smell when you open that package. You find your smell, everybody's nose, everybody's taste, that's why some people like Darjeeling, some people like, Orange Pekoe, some people like Yunnan, some people like Ceylon tea. Ceylon tea is very popular because most of the Ceylon tea you see in the market is not Ceylon tea. Ceylon tea only comes from Sri Lanka, but taking that plant and growing it in the Black Sea region of Turkey and introducing as Chycoriza Ceylon doesn't make that tea Ceylon. It needs Ceylon earth, it needs Ceylon climate, it needs Ceylon soil, Ceylon water to become Ceylon tea, just like some grapes when you're doing wine, vineyard business. So, but you find your own taste, you find your own aroma, you make sure they are tea leaves. Never overbrew tea, never keep it more than what it should. Chinese and Japanese keep it very short, we Europeans keep it much longer. Chinese and Japanese keep it like if you're ever in a Chinese tea tasting tea, it's 30 seconds. For some tea they say 28 seconds, 32 seconds. They're so careful with it. They have their, sand clocks and they only keep the tea leaves that much in the boiling water. They say now it's ready. After this it gets bitter. After this it gets boiled. Russians and Turks like bitter tea. That's why they brew it again and again on the samovars, and they like it dark, black, bitter. For example, that's their taste, they love it. If you serve that tea to the Chinese, they will say this is horrible tea, so it is that matter. And when you're putting, you might know from your mothers, from your grandmothers, maybe yourselves, of course, you always spare a spoonful of tea for the pot. Even if you're making it not like Turkish tea brewing or Russian tea, but in a teapot with a certain, instrument that you can capture the tea inside, put a little bit more than the number of tea you are going to be serving. Because the pot, in an invisible way, consumes tea. So there's the pot's share. You have to have some for the pot. That is the color. That is to have a good color, to be able to have a good, strong taste. If you're putting it into your cup, it's different. Then you can put 1 spoon per cup. But if you're making it for 6 people in the teapot, you put teaspoons and you put the 7 spoon extra for the pot. Okay, that is one of the major features.